So my name is Shaz Akram, and I'm the Executive Director of the Women's Foreign Policy Group. And I'd like to welcome you all today for the conversation on leadership and diplomacy. The Women's Foreign Policy Group is a network of international affairs professionals dedicated to advancing women's leadership and amplifying their voices through substantive global issues programs and mentoring, as well as diversifying the pipeline and preparing the next generation of leadership through mentoring and professional development. I'd like to thank Shaima Gargash and the United Arab Emirates Embassy today, especially for all their work in bringing together such an excellent program. I also want to recognize my Women's Foreign Policy Group Board of Directors, co-chairs Lois Romano, Christy Rogers, Vice Chair Teresa Lahr, board members Carmiel Arbit and Andrea Thompson. Our members, I also want to thank all of you for making the time to join us today, and my colleagues, Travis, Ginger, and Tiana. I also want to specially recognize one of our first male members, Stanley Kober. Thank you for your support over the decades that you continue to join us at our programs. The program will start with a conversation followed by a brief Q&A. We will then break for a buffet lunch, kindly provided by the embassy. Each table will have a question to discuss during lunch, led by a facilitator. We have tried to inform all our facilitators of their roles, but some of you have had to kindly step in at the very last minute. We are very appreciative of your support on that. Today's conversation will be led by Women's Foreign Policy Group Board of Director Carmiel Arbit. Carmiel has worked at the intersection of foreign policy and government relations for nearly 2 decades. She's a non-resident senior fellow for Middle East programs at the Atlantic Council. As co-founder of Key Bridge Strategies, she has consulted for nonprofit organizations around the world, advancing government relations, public diplomacy, and community engagement strategies on 4 continents. She has worked as a government relations professional for APAC, AJC, and Thomson Reuters, and as a researcher at the Brookings Institution Center of Middle East Policy. Carmiel earned her bachelor's from George Washington University and her master's in science from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. She has been recognized as a top foreign policy influencer by Diplomatic Courier. She's a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a Truman National Security Fellow. Also joining the conversation is Shaima Gargash, the Deputy Chief of Mission at the Embassy of the United Arab Emirates. Previously, Shaima was the head of the embassy's Communications and Diplomacy Department and a political analyst in the Congressional Affairs Division. Prior to her diplomatic post in Washington, D.C., she led the Policy Division in the Policy Planning Department at the UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, MOFAC. In this role, she evaluated and developed policy recommendations, prepared policy briefs, and guidance for senior UAE officials and diplomats, led training programs, and managed a team of policy analysts. And she has been the DCM since 2019. Before joining MOFAC, she worked in the public and private sectors, including banking and real estate, and honed her skills handling complex economic and socio-political issues. The conversation is recorded and on the record, but the table discussions will be off the record. And with that, Carmiel, I'll turn the program over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Excellent. Well, first of all, Shaima, I just want to thank you for hosting us for this beautiful luncheon. You're all going to have to sit tight. Once this portion of the program is through, the buffet will open. Shaima, we've had a chance to get to know each other a little bit through this partnership between the UAE Embassy and Women's Foreign Policy Group. And I'm really excited for everyone here to get to know more about you too. I know you've worked with a lot of the people here, but maybe they haven't had a chance to hear more than the bio as you've read it. One of the things that we hear when we read your bio is how you've really worked your way up through the government. It's not just that you've come in and out. And these events at Women's Foreign Policy Group are as much about networking as they are about professional development and women's empowerment. Talk to us a little bit about your career. What drew you to diplomacy, and how did you work your way up in the diplomatic field?
Well, I think I fell on diplomacy by accident. I come from a very business-oriented family on both sides, and after trying out the banking sector and not finding the right, economic job that I was looking for, I met an old colleague, and she offered me a job to work for the federal government. And on my first day, the first project I was assigned was to work on a women's report about women's first political participation in the UAE, which was, opening the elections, parliamentary elections in 2006. And that was kind of my first venture into government. And then I also tackled quite a lot combating human trafficking in the human rights file and the women's file. I don't think my parents back then were okay with me joining the government. And when I moved to Abu Dhabi, my husband didn't allow me to join the Foreign Service because I was traveling too much in my previous job. So it took me 2 years of discreetly looking for the right job for me after getting married, after having my first child. And I had to sneak into Abu Dhabi and do all the necessary interviews. And so my husband didn't like his job at the oil company, and so we broke a deal. I'm like, you quit your job, I joined the Foreign Service, and we're not going to tell anyone until all is confirmed. And that's what happened. So it's been wonderful. I think working on social, economic, and political policy has been phenomenal. I think the research behind that has been great and a big eye-opener for me. And I think what I did not kind of anticipate is how much the UAE government was actually investing in social development and women's rights, but also kind of improving living situation for everyone living in the UAE. And so for me, that was kind of the breaking point, and for me to kind of, I just fell in love with the government. Tackling policies on Afghanistan and women and combating human trafficking, I think that for me was the winner. There was a lot that was being worked on, and people didn't see, they only saw kind of the small part of the work that was being done. And then joining the Foreign Service, I think I've always wanted to serve my country. Moving to Abu Dhabi, my parents did not like it. Obviously, I am from Dubai, so my husband's from Abu Dhabi, and that for them was like, it didn't go so well for a couple of months. And when I moved here in DC, my parents, again, coming from the Middle East, and I think this applies to all kind of my female colleagues, is if you've seen the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding, that's how our families are. And so moving here, first year or two, my parents were convincing everyone, she needs to come back. She doesn't need the job. She needs to come back. But I think it's been wonderful working, developing myself, meeting new colleagues, working on interesting portfolios. But there was also an interesting story of the UAE to tell here. And so going into Congress, that was another thing that was really excited me and my colleagues joining. It's because we work on these policies, but we never get to talk about it. And then moving on to, heading the communications, public diplomacy, my colleague Hassa here is now the new head, or she's been heading it for almost 3 years. It's been exciting because I get to work with a lot of my female colleagues. More than half of the heads of departments at the embassy are women. We have Dan Al-Marashi, who heads the cultural diplomacy. Hassa heads communication. We have our head of political, who's also a female, but she's off to another meeting. So I'm the DCM female. And so it's been exciting. It's been kind of a whirlwind of experience. but, you know, it doesn't end here.
That's a pretty considerable female representation at the embassy. You know, the UAE also has pretty considerable female representation in government. The Federal National Council is now 50% women. You've been studying women's female participation from the beginning of your career. I'm curious, what impact has that had on UAE policy? And I'll ask tongue-in-cheek, for countries like the United States, where women and many of our issues aren't well represented, what are some of the things that we should be thinking about here?
I think before we go into kind of, you know, female representation, I think women have always been represented in the UAE community and society. And this dates back even before, you know, the country's inception 50 years ago. Women took a major lead in economic growth in the UAE, investment, when men would go pearling. And we have a few of our UAE participants at the Folklife Festival, and a few of the fishermen who actually tell the story of them going on sea for 3 to 4 months a time, and the women would be taking care of the household. And we were always part of the development in the UAE. In terms of the government, you know, I think 2/3 of employees in the federal government are female. There's actually more female in the government than the private sector, and that's, again, also in the private sector is also increasing. The policies that the government have set to encourage entities to employ more women, to empower more women, has just been a catalyst. So it's definitely, it's not a top-down approach, but it's also a bottom-up approach, because there is a lot of acceptance in that. In terms of the FNC you had mentioned, so in 2005, our former president, Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan, issued a decree. And he announced gradual expansion of parliamentary elections. And in the Electoral College, it was expanding every 4 years. So initially, our Federal National Council, or Parliament, was set up in 1972. Since 1972 up to 2006, they have only been men being represented. There are 40 members of Parliament. When the elections took place, there was a big anticipation for women who were part of the Electoral College to run. And the interesting part is we have the General Women's Union, collaborated with UNDP, and they conducted a number of workshops across the 7 Emirates on how women should be conducting campaigns, what kind of themes they need to be highlighting, and almost all the male participants or candidates who were running for elections had either their wives, their daughters, their sisters who were part of their campaign. And so there was a big encouragement. In 2006, women were represented. So half the parliament was appointed, the other half was nominated by the rulers of each emirate. And of the elected members of parliament, in 2006, the 3rd highest vote went to a female participant or a candidate from Abu Dhabi. You see more participation, the topics in parliament have changed, and the female members of parliament are not just members in these social committees, but they're also part in the defense committees, economic committees, and so they're represented in every single committee within the parliament. And I remember when I was working, it took us 2 years, and we worked with the Dubai School of Government, Ambassador London Seba, who's our permanent representative to the UN. She and I were working, and a couple of other colleagues were working on the report. And, I had to go and interview the members of parliament at the FNC. And the first thing that a lot of the female mentioned is, they had to change the parliament itself because there were no bathrooms for women, right? There were no waiting rooms for women. There were no resting rooms for members of parliament. And the meetings would go to midnight. And so small changes was, you'd see a white paper stuck on the door. It's like, women, and the other was for men. But historically, it was basically dominated by men. They didn't even think about that. And so I think women came in very strongly in government. The parliament is just one aspect of it. And you'll see a lot of women from society, from the communities, from the constituents coming into the parliament, meeting with the members of parliament, attending these sessions. And it's open to public. And so it just encouraged more women to speak up and to convey issues that men didn't even think about, which is always exciting. And I think this is why the UAE government has encouraged more and more women to be part of the development of the country.
That's great. You know, wherever we see strides for women, we also see challenges around the world. And I'd be interested to hear what you see as the biggest challenges for women in the UAE. And I'm particularly interested in women's equality in certain social contexts, marriage, divorce, guardianship. What is the UAE government doing to address these issues?
I think there's more equality amongst gender in the UAE. Obviously, you know, we're not perfect. There are still a lot of things that, you know, we're working on. And I think the issues that the women in the UAE face are very, very similar, even identical to the women outside the UAE across the globe. I think one of the biggest challenges that we found, and I think a lot of the private sector also, if women here struggle, is we see less and less women in senior positions, and that's because they would sacrifice it for, you know, their families and give that more attention. But I think there is more facilitation from the UAE side to encourage more women to be in leadership and senior positions, you know, with maternity leaves, with you know, even paternity leaves, with kind of flexibility, especially during COVID. I think a lot of kind of work circumstances had to change, and so they had to make it more nimble for women to stay in their careers and jobs. In terms of pay, there's equal pay, and recently, I think in 2016, I would say, no, not 16, I think 2014 or 13, there was an establishment of the Gender Balance Council that was announced. And that council specifically looked at reviewing all constitutional laws and policies and how to encourage more women to be represented in senior positions and what policies need to be altered. And so a lot of these councils and offices in the UAE are opening up, and the government is listening to them. They're looking at reviewing policies, coming up with recommendations, but also working with parliament. And it's not just the local level, but also at a federal level, including the private sector too. And so there is a lot of kind of work that, you know, public-private partnership happening on all fronts to encourage more women to go and continue in the workforce.
Great. I want to shift gears a little bit now to look at the region. An issue that's of great interest to me and many of my Atlantic Council colleagues who are sprinkled across your tables as well is normalization and our flagship N7 work that many folks here are involved in as well. The 2020 normalization agreements between Israel and Arab neighbors really transformed the region. But expectations were also incredibly high. And I'm curious to hear what your experience has been. Have these agreements met these expectations? Have there been disappointments? And what surprised you in the aftermath of peace between the UAE and Israel?
I think, you know, this started when the ambassador, Yusuf El-Ateba, wrote an article in Hebrew, in a Jewish article. And he spoke about, you know, stopping annexation and the importance of working together. August 13 was when basically the normalization was announced, and the signing of the Abraham Accord was on 15th September. And I don't think anyone had any expectation. You know, we've not had a war with Israel. We don't share borders. But there was a focus towards the future. There was a focus towards kind of benefiting the people in the region. And the way to do that was to open more dialogue and speak to all players in the region. The Abraham Accord was a wonderful way to connect people, and I think it was more about the people than the government itself. The first agreement that was signed was an MOU between two universities in UAE and Israel on artificial intelligence and advanced sciences, and then there was food security, businesses too. And I think because there was no expectation, but we wanted to work together, I think that was the encouragement. Bahrain joined, Morocco followed, and a few others are kind of also curious. But a lot of countries are waiting to see how far this is going to go. And in the end, this is going to benefit not just the people in the UAE and Israel, but in Palestine, in the region itself. It's more about the stability. But we also want to emphasize on, opening trade and businesses and share information and take that forward. And I think we've not been lucky geographically. The region has had a lot of unrest, and I think now's the time to provide a bit more stability and dialogue for future generations.
That's great. Just staying on this, you mentioned a lot of the economic opportunities, but I think what's been interesting about normalization is some of the cultural opportunities that have come from it. One of the things that I've seen in the work that I've done is how exposure can really change perceptions. I'd be curious what opportunities the UAE has sought out to use this moment to promote tolerance, to fight hate, whether it's perceptions like anti-Semitism or other views of the other generally.
I think on the interfaith and inclusivity aspect, the UAE has been basically at the forefront of it. And we've recently announced, and we've already broken ground in the Abrahamic Family House. And that in itself brings the three Abrahamic religions together. Historically, we've always been peacefully living together, engaging, doing business. And so, something happened in between, but now we need to move forward. And I think this opening up and accepting of cultures and religions is, we basically look at our common values, and our common values are more identical than our differences. And so working on the things that we see eye to eye on in terms of economic stability and opportunity and future and prosperity. And this is what we all want. And, the American Jewish Council, we also recently opened an office in Abu Dhabi. We have different communities. The Sikh temple is opening up in Abu Dhabi. And so you can have all these religions, and you can have all these kind of different ethnicities and backgrounds, and live peacefully. And I think the UAE is a wonderful example of that, because we've always been so cosmopolitan, even again before independence, before 1971. And so it just proves that we can live together peacefully, and we need to move forward towards dialogue and diplomacy, and that's kind of the path forward.
Iran is a lurking presence in the region, if you will. Earlier this week, the Wall Street Journal reported on a supposed secret meeting between some of the curious countries that you alluded to, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, but also the UAE, Bahrain, meeting to explore opportunities for mutual cooperation and responding to Iran's ballistic and drone capabilities. Simultaneously, we have an ongoing will they, won't they with the JCPOA. There's an Iran expert in the room. We'll ask her after this, will they, won't they? All of this is obviously a concern percolating for the UAE. If there is an agreement struck, what can we expect from the UAE? And frankly, if there isn't, what should we expect?
I think historically we've always, Iran's our neighbor. We've had a historic relationship with Iran, even trade. Things have changed. We can't pick and choose who our neighbors are, but and we have opened a line of communication with Iran. I think that's also very important. But that also doesn't mean that we're okay with their meddling in the region. We see that happening, and I think, Iran's nuclear power is definitely a threat. But even more important is their meddling in the region. We can see examples, across the Levant, from Iraq down to the Levant. We see that also in Yemen. And so having consensus on the importance of stability in the region, that everyone has a responsibility in our part of the world to make sure that it's safe. And for the UAE, it being a very small country too, and neighboring countries as well, we want to make sure that, our neighbors don't ruin our business, right? We want tourism, we want trade, we also want it to be safe for our people. It's the UAE government, the UAE government's responsible not just for its nationals, but also for every single human being living within its borders. And so that for us is very crucial. Now, whether the JCPOA will be signed or not, and I think Iran's not going to change. Iran's not going to go anywhere. And so we need to find a way to have a relationship with Iran and to stop the meddling in the region and to ensure that, we protect our countries.
Shifting to another part of the region, I want to talk a little bit about Yemen. A truce was reached in spring that has been extended, but in the time leading up to that, the human toll in Yemen has been devastating. At the same time, we saw a Houthi attack on an Emirati airport that jeopardized UAE security in a way the Emirates had never experienced. Do you see the truce as sustainable? What do you see as the future for Yemen, and what role will the UAE play?
So the UAE withdrew a couple years ago, and our engagement was combating AQAP. Also, the UAE withdrawing from Yemen gives more ground for the Yemenis to talk to each other. I think the Special Envoy has, done tremendous work in bringing the different Yemeni factions together. But in the end, it's a decision of the Yemenis and what they want with Yemen, what they want the future of Yemen to look like. And I think even before the pressure of the war on Yemen, Yemen was not, Yemen's economic situation wasn't even great back then. It's just gotten even worse, unfortunately, especially on the human toll. And so the UAE will continue its humanitarian assistance to Yemen. We'll make sure that, we can encourage the various parties to speak to each other, but that's as much as we can do.
Turning to tragedy elsewhere, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has amounted to one of the greatest calamities the Western world has seen in a generation. How would you characterize the UAE's response?
So it's, it's unfortunate seeing that the military and political situation is just escalating between Ukraine and Russia. Which is not in anyone's favor, specifically on the people in Ukraine. We can see the impact and the spillover effect on the energy market, on the food security element. And, we encourage dialogue, we encourage diplomacy. The UAE will continue to provide humanitarian assistance because we do not want to feed into the war. We want all parties to speak to each other, and I think that's really important. And I think one country impacts the whole globe, and this has been the example of that. And so we just hope that, all parties get to an agreement. Diplomacy is very important, but also we need to really look into the human suffering, victims of the situation.
On the economic situation, which you mentioned, I'm curious, there's been a lot of mixed reporting on this over the last few weeks. Does the UAE have the ability to increase its oil production to offset the impact that Russia has had on world energy supplies? Or is the UAE at this point maxed?
I think this is not something for me to answer on. I don't have the answer to that, nor am I an oil expert. I think that will leave to OPEC and the OPEC plus countries to discuss. Potentially, Biden will be going to the region next month, and maybe that will be one of the talking points.
And what about sanctions? One of the concerns that America and really the world has is that Russia will look for opportunities to evade sanctions wherever possible, oligarchs moving their yachts around the world to try to hide from government authorities. The UAE has a lot of experience in dealing with sanctions evasion, including with Iranians who've tried to do this on Emirati oil. I'm just interested in how you're now coping with a similar threat from Russia.
I think with sanctions, it's always been tricky because it's also impacting the private sector too. And I think with the example of Iran, everyone's really careful doing business with any potential country or individual that is sanctioned, because they're going to bear the brunt of all the financial penalties. There's also, I think on sanctions, there's a lot of, needs to be a lot of clarity between various parties, whether it's a bilateral sanction or multilateral. But again, we follow and abide all sanctions that are implemented. We also work with the United States very well in ensuring that the sanctions are very well implemented, conducting briefings with various entities, private and government. And so, we obviously don't want to violate any sanctions, and so we will be working very closely with the U.S. on that.
I'm mindful of the fact that there is a room full of people who have their own and better questions here, and I want to make time for them. But I want to pick up on something you mentioned in the beginning, which is the Folklife Festival that's happening on the Mall as we sit here today. I hope everyone will have a chance to go check it out and get a little bit of a taste of the UAE. But I'd love to hear from you. What do you hope people will take away from kind of that experience and also this one? What's a key message if you can't get on a plane and go to Dubai or Abu Dhabi or Sharjah? You once told us great stories of your own travels through the UAE. If you're sitting at Shaima's table, you have to ask her. But what is that one thing, if you can't get there, that people will come to think of and associate with the UAE?
I think when, again, seconding what you said, everyone needs to go and visit the Folklife Festival. It's the National Mall. The festival is on the Mall until the 4th of July, correct, Donna? Donna's here, and you can ask her more questions about the Folklife. Most of our participants are female as well. But I think the interesting part and the message I want to convey is, we're very similar, more similar than people expect. But also we're very open, friendly. You'll notice on the National Mall, different women wearing different, covering their heads, women covering their faces. And so you'll see a big spectrum of people, but you see how, and the Folklife Festival not only includes UAE nationals, but also UAE residents, because they are the people of the UAE. And I think this is what is so wonderful. Going to the UAE is 80% of our population is expatriate. There are over 200 nationalities, over 100, languages being spoken. And so the UAE is very identical to the US. Our people are extremely friendly. We're used to the cosmopolitan society, very open. We all speak English. And so I think it's definitely a place for you guys to go and check it out. And it's not just about the past of the UAE, it's about the future, and the engagement and the role of youth in the UAE's, future and advanced sciences and technology, and kind of that's where we are today.
Great. Okay, and with that, I'd like to open the floor to questions. I know at least one or two of my Women's Foreign Policy Group colleagues will be walking around with microphones, but feel free to raise your hand and project. Jomana. Whoop. I think bring the mic up. And please introduce yourself and tell us your affiliation and then ask a question. And a reminder that questions end with question marks as opposed to long statements.
Yeah.
Please,
So,
Giovanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carmi and Shaima, for the really wonderful conversation. My name is Jumana Kador, and I'm a colleague of Carmi's at the Atlantic Council. I wanted to just touch on, I lead the Syria file at the Atlantic Council, so obviously Syria and the Levant in general is very near and dear to my heart. So I wanted to hear a little bit from you, if you could shed some light on, we saw that, President Assad was recently in the UAE. Where is the UAE planning to go from there? Also, the UAE and Saudi have been showing more interest in what's happening in neighboring Lebanon. And so I just wanted to hear a little bit more from you on Levant policy. Thank you.
We've basically not had a relationship with Syria for close to a decade. And I think a few months ago, or last year, our foreign minister visited Syria. The message behind that is we want to realign Syria back into the Arab front. I think show more commitment, more dialogue, open dialogue with Syria, bring Syria back into the Arab game, move away from Iran. But also it's about the people of Syria. It's about, there's this refugee situation, unfortunately, that needs to be resolved. But we can't resolve it if we're not talking to each other, if we don't have dialogue. In terms of Lebanon, the UAE is trying to help. I think Saudi is more engaged in Lebanon than the UAE is. But we do not want to see any of the Arab countries fall, and specifically fall to Iranian regime or powers or militias or regime. And so the realignment of countries back into the Arab front is extremely crucial. And you can see kind of across kind of the crescent, the Levant crescent. 20 years ago it was run by Arabs. Recently it's been run by Iran. And so we want to realign that front, show engagement. But again, it's about the people in the region. And I think the Abraham Accord is specifically that. We're working with Israel on the Abraham Accord for the people, for the opportunities, and for the Palestinians. And this kind of the spillover effect will go to other countries. And so again, the move that the UAE is taking is for bettering the region. And we can't neglect it even more, because the youth will take over, and we want to make sure that they have the opportunities for them.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Elizabeth with We Connect International, with my colleague Patricia. And we are so encouraged by what we're seeing in the UAE with women as business owners, and wanted some of your insights on what do you see as the potential for better trade relations within foreign policy that would lead to more inclusive economic development, better economic integration, peace and security, all the things that you lead on.
So there's definitely been a lot of advancements on the women front in the UAE. There's more encouragement for women to grow their businesses, to be part of the supply chain. There are more and more chambers of commerce specific and dedicated to women that are providing workshops, but we're also partnering and working with many international organizations on how to grow that. The economic departments in the UAE and the banking sector is also providing more facilitation for women, and kind of grow beyond the homegrown businesses. Facilitating opening bank accounts, getting a loan from the bank. And so there is more of that happening today. And I think there's more support than ever in terms of the policies that are coming out, but also the networks that are expanding in the UAE.
Teresa?
Hi, I'm Teresa Lohr on the Board of Directors of Women's Foreign Policy Group, and I want to thank you for your work on human trafficking and ask you if some of the very significant worker welfare protections that were put in place during the Dubai Expo big infrastructure build will be permanent and expanded to other parts of the UAE.
So the answer is yes. In terms of the welfare system, women's protection and rights is definitely something that the UAE is always looking into, always expanding. We work with a number of agencies in the UAE, from various women's shelters, the Red Crescent, but also Ministry of Social Development. There are lots of committees in the UAE that are also comprised of representative various communities in the UAE that also bring new topics to the table. And so that will always be advancing.
Yes, here. And why don't we do this? I'll take 2 questions at a time because I see a lot and I smell that incredible food. And so let's see if we can get more questions in and also get faster to the lunch. So let's start here with the woman in red and then the woman in blue behind her.
Marlene Davis with Motorola Solutions, and we've been in Dubai for many, many years, working in the UAE. My question is, there is a healthy competition between UAE and friendly competition between the UAE and Saudi Arabia for global presence in country. UAE has taken several steps and initiatives to encourage presence of global companies in the UAE. I'm wondering if you could share with us some of the initiatives and areas that you are leading on, for example, space. So if you could give us like a list of we're doing this, 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 and this, so.
Wait, pin it one moment. Let's take one more question and then we'll answer them both together. In the back here in blue.
Good afternoon. My name is Daphne Titus. I'm a senior State Department alumna who's the founder and principal of Mapasa Strategies, a boutique consulting firm that focuses on natural resources in general and critical minerals in particular. My question is, the U.S. has suffered a lot from cancellations and other travel tribulations at its major airports. I'm wondering whether or not the airports in Abu Dhabi and Dubai are experiencing the same phenomenon.
Okay, so travel and then travel and how easily can we come to the UAE this summer without getting delayed? For those of us who can't make it across the U.S. And then healthy competition with the Saudis, particularly areas like space.
So I think the UAE economy and market is very different than the Saudi. And I think the UAE definitely has absolute advantages in a number of sectors. And you mentioned space, there's the financial sector, but also the free zones, logistics, airlines, travel. Saudi is opening up more and more. And so they have a much larger population. They have a very different composition of their, various sectors in their economy. And I think it's, competition is always healthy. And I think without that, there won't be any drive and strive towards kind of advancing and progressing. A few decades ago, Bahrain was the financial hub in the region. Today, it's Dubai. Space was never really a thing, and I think it was more in Israel. Now we are competing and advancing in that. There's also clean energy, for instance, that a lot of other countries in the region that are also kind of not just emulating, but also trying to diversify their sources of energy. Food security is another. And I think our engagement and the Abraham Accord has been wonderful on that front because Israel is pretty well advanced in terms of food security as well. And so it's always a learning curve for us, but we also have an absolute advantage because, the UAE is only 50 years old. And so other countries have progressed before us, and so we've gained from their experiences. But we also have kind of a wonderful composition of people in the UAE. And I think everyone brings in their expertise. But also, geographically, the UAE is located in, I think the UAE can reach 2/3 two-thirds the countries in the world, within 7 hours, right? And so geographically, we're located in the midst of all that. We have wonderful national carriers, and logistics is huge. So for us, services, re-exports, space, clean energy are kind of the sectors, and the financial sector too. And so these are kind of our sectors that we're kind of have advanced in and are advancing even more.
Okay, last two questions from this table here.
On travel? On travel. So on travel, I think the airports never really officially closed. I think each airline and each airport had their own strategies. I think we had some stringent COVID policies in the last kind of 2.5, let's say 3 years. But other than that, for us, tourism is really crucial in the UAE, travel. And as I mentioned, 80% of our population is expatriate, and a lot of them would want to go and travel. And so the airports always need to be open, just is managed in a different way.
Okay, last two questions. Right here, ladies.
Hello, hi, good afternoon. I'm Cindy Wee. I'm the DCM of Singapore Embassy, your neighbor down the road. So like you, I'm a proud mother of a young girl, except with extra challenges as she's moving into her teenage years. So yeah, everyone who is mother know what I'm talking about. I'm seeking your advice. As we read about, from Western media as well as think tanks about the tensions between the UAE and the United States. So I'm trying to sieve out the truth, between all these articles and reports talking about the relations, the current state of relations between the UAE and the United States. So could I seek your advice on this? Thank you.
Hello, thank you both so much. I'm Jessica Sarhan. I'm from the Truman Center. I think my question's a nice caveat from yours, less hard-hitting. I would love to know what's your favorite thing about America, and did anything surprise you when you first moved here and started working here? I'll preface that by saying, when I first moved here, I don't think my British sarcasm always landed as well as it could have, but would love to hear about your favorite thing about the US.
That would be a great note to kick us off on. So let's start with the tensions and then end with the with the best part of the USA. What a great patriotic 4th of July way to send us off.
From the British accent. I think on the bilateral relations with the United States, and I think we always need to keep in mind that we deal with people, and there are always kind of people are people. But I think the UAE has been quite fortunate to have actually a strong relationship with the United States, strong ally. There are always kind of frustrations here and there. And I think, the most recent frustration was U.S. reaction to the Houthi attack on Abu Dhabi. But the relationships still continue because of how important the United States is to the UAE. I think we've fought in 6 wars with the United States. We're the largest trading partner for the U.S. in the region. The U.S. is so important to us at a lot of levels, but also, on the human-to-human kind of level, the United States is a fascinating place for our people, thanks to public diplomacy and U.S. media. But I think the United States will remain extremely crucial in the region, and the UAE will remain and try to remain an important ally for the U.S. for the sake of stability in the region, and trade. But there's also a lot of new opportunities that haven't been explored with the United States, and I think that's what we're moving into: education, healthcare, and so much more. Oh, my favorite thing? I think my favorite thing about the U.S. is it's pretty unique that every state is different. And so if you wanted to travel and wanted a different kind of weather climate, just hop on a domestic flight. And I think the one thing that I really, really love here is the people. I think it's, Like, truly speaking, I think one of the kindest people I've ever met and engaged in dealing with, you know, an American official or diplomats is very easy. I don't see much differences. That's very similar to the UAE, ironically, but the United States is. I also think that my colleagues will share the same ideas. And there's always eagerness, you know, there's always excitement to know more. The U.S. always wants to know more, which we're always excited to talk, you know, and engage more about. So it's, I think that's what I truly like. I think the people more than anything.
Shaima, I want to thank you so much for such an interesting and far-ranging conversation. Needless to say, the UAE is incredibly lucky to have you representing them, and Women's Foreign Policy Group is so fortunate to count you as a friend. So thank you for this discussion. For the moment you've all been waiting for, to sample some of the incredible Emirati food that is waiting. I think we're going to just do open. Feel free to step up to any of the buffets, first come, first serve. Try not to shove each other on the way. Once everybody's seated again, we're going to move into a slightly different format where our goal is to really have one conversation at the table. And as Shaz mentioned, there's someone at your table who's been designated to help carry that conversation along and facilitate. But we're hoping it will give you a chance to talk about some of the challenging issues that women in leadership are facing around the world and to get to know one another. So thank you. Bon appetit.